Hello and welcome to lesson 5 of the Basic Music Theory course. In this lesson I want to look at intervals and how to calculate intervals. For this lesson you are going to need to know all of the topics that were discussed in lessons 1, 2, 3 and 4. So you're going to need to know your flat rule, your sharp rule, major keys, major scales, minor scales. So you're going to need to know them pretty well in order to do this lesson. So, what are intervals? Well, basically intervals are just the distance between two notes. Okay, that's all that an interval is. It's just a fancy way of saying the distance between two notes. Before I show you how to calculate intervals, I just want to demonstrate the difference between melodic and harmonic intervals. Okay, it's actually quite easy. So we'll just draw the treble clef and say we wanted to know the distance or the interval between G and D. Okay. In order to calculate intervals, the very first thing you must remember is that you always calculate from the bottom note to the top note. Never the other way around. You never calculate from the top note down. It's always from the bottom note up. Okay. So if you wanted to know the distance or the interval between G and D, you count from G up to D. So G would be 1, A would be 2, B would be 3, C would be 4, and D would be 5. So you know that the distance, just delete that a wee bit. You know that the distance between that G and the D is going to be a fifth. Okay? You don't know what type of fifth yet because that's what the bottom half of this slide deals with, the type of fifth, but you know that it's a fifth of some description. Okay? So it is a fifth. We call that a melodic interval because the two notes come after each other. Sorry, that's a wee bit messy, I'll try. Yeah, sorry about my writing. That's called a melodic interval because the two notes come after each other. Okay, so the G comes first and the D comes second. Okay, a harmonic interval would look like this. The G and the D sound together. In other words, they're in harmony. They're harmonic. So that is a harmonic interval. It's still called a fifth. Okay, so it doesn't really change the description as such when you're dealing with the numeric part of the description, the fifth, or if you're calling it a perfect fifth or whatever. Okay, it's still a fifth. Okay, so you call it a harmonic perfect fifth if you want it to be really technical. So the only main difference then between melodic and harmonic intervals is just in what way the notes are sound together, or do they sound apart. Okay, so if they sound together, they're harmonic. If they sound apart from each other, then they're melodic. So that's really what the difference of a melodic and harmonic interval is. What would happen if instead of having the bottom note coming first, we had the top note, then the bottom note? It's a trick question. Actually, it doesn't change it at all. It's still called a melodic interval because the two notes don't sound together, they sound apart. And it's still a fifth because you always calculate from the bottom note to the top note. Okay, so even though the top note comes first in the music and the G comes second, you still calculate the distance from the G up to the D. It's still a fifth. Okay. Okay, so what I've drawn there is basically all the notes in a scale that belong to the key of C major. So we have our D, we have our E, our F, our G, our A, B, and C. And I've just drawn the key note, the tonic note under each one. So they're all harmonic intervals basically. Okay, so when you're calculating intervals, as I said, the number one thing to remember is you count from the bottom note up. That's the first rule. The second rule is you've got to ask yourself, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? I'll say that again because it's very important to memorize. Does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? Okay, so you've got to ask yourself, does that D belong to the bottom note, which is C? Does that D belong to C major? Is it part of the C major scale? It is. Okay, because C major doesn't have any sharps or flats, so it's just all the natural notes. Okay, So D does belong to the bottom note's major scale. If the top note does belong to the bottom note's major scale, then we call them the interval by these following names on this side of the board. Okay, so if it's a second, we call it a major second. If it's a third, we call it a major third. If it's a fourth, we call it a perfect fourth. Okay, not a major fourth. There's no such thing as a major fourth. We call a fifth a perfect fifth. Again, same thing. No such thing as a major fifth. And we call a sixth a major sixth. We call a seventh a major seventh. And an octave we call a perfect octave. No such thing as a major octave. Okay. Now the reasons why we have perfect fourths, fifths, and octaves is because those notes are quite special when we make up harmony. Those notes sound very good together. Okay, so they're given a special name because they have a good they're very harmonious. Okay. Whereas major seconds and thirds and major sixths and sevenths can also be quite harmonious, but those intervals, the fourth, fifth, and octave, are the very, very strong intervals. Okay, so they get a special name. So C to D is a second, and as we just worked out, D is part of the C major scale, so that would be known as a major second. Okay, sorry, just write it a wee bit thinner than that before I run out of room. So yeah, that would be a major second. C to E is a third, so that would be a major third. C to F is a fourth, so that is a perfect fourth. C to G is a fifth, so that's a perfect fifth. C to A is a sixth, so that's a major sixth. C to B is a seventh, so that's a major seventh. And C to C is an octave, so that's a perfect octave. And as you can see, they're all capital M, capital P. Okay, so capital M for major second, third, sixth, and seventh, and capital P for perfect fourth, fifth, and octave. Okay, so that's if the top note belongs to the bottom note's major scale. Try a few more, except this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the bottom note. So I'm no longer going to have C's. I'm going to have different notes, just to make it a wee bit more difficult and just to show you, well, what happens if you're not dealing with the key of C major. Okay, so say for example I wanted to know this interval. Oops, I better draw it a wee bit thicker than that so you can see it properly. Okay, C to E. Oh, sorry, D to E. So we're looking for the distance of D to E. So the very first thing you do is count how far away the top note is from the bottom note. Okay, so from the bottom note upwards, D to E is a second of some description. Okay, so you should know that this is going to be some type of second. Okay, but you have to ask, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? So does E belong to the scale of D major? It does. D major has an F sharp and a C sharp in it. Okay, but E is just normal, so it does have an E in its scale. And if it has an E in its scale, then you call it by that type of second, a major second. Okay. What about, I'll try a few more. D to F sharp. This is why you need to know your major scales, your minor scales, and your key signatures off by heart. Because now you've got to ask yourself, does F sharp belong to the scale, the key of D major? And it does. Okay, so you haven't raised any note here or anything. You haven't altered that top note. That top note does belong to the bottom note's major scale, so that's still a major third. Okay, that's a major third, D to F sharp. Okay, because it's 3 notes up from D. And let's see, I'll try a few more in D because D's a good key. What about D to A? Does A belong in the scale of D major? It does, because D major, as I said, only has an F and C sharp. So you can ask yourself, what is the distance? Count up from D. D's 1, E's 2, F is 3, G is 4. So A would be a fifth. Okay, and as I said, it's part of the bottom note's major scale, so it's a perfect fifth. And try one more in D major. What about D to C sharp? Well, you should guess it by now. D major does have a C sharp in its scale, so that top note does belong to the bottom note's major scale. So you could ask yourself, what's the distance first of all? Well, D is 1, E is 2, F is 3, G is 4, A is 5, B is 6th, and C is a 7th. And because the top note belongs to the bottom note's major scale, we call it a major 7th. Okay, so you have to know your key signatures very well in order to do this. I'll try one more with flats, I think, this time, just for a bit of variety. Just let me rub all this out. Okay, so say now we're calculating the interval between B flat, why not? B flat to C. Okay, so there's a harmonic interval of B flat to C. Well, what's the distance between B and C, first of all? Well, it's a second. Okay, so at least we know that it's a second. We haven't worked out what type of second, because we have to ask ourselves, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? In other words, does C belong to the scale of B flat major? And it does. B flat major just has a B flat and an E flat in its scale, so C belongs to B flat major. So that means that that's a major second. Okay, because C exists in the scale of B flat major. Try one more, I think, and then we'll move on to more complicated intervals. What about B flat to E flat? So we've got to ask now, what is the distance between B and E? Well, B is 1, C would be 2, D would be 3, and E is 4. So we know it's a fourth of some description. We don't know what type of fourth it is until we ask ourselves, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? In other words, does E flat belong to the scale of B flat major? And it does, because B flat has a B flat in the key signature and an E flat in the key signature. So E should normally be flattened, so because of that, it's a perfect fourth. Okay, so basically that in the last 8 minutes or so will demonstrate to you how to calculate intervals from the top note or from the bottom note to the top note. Very first thing you do is you count how far away are the two notes. So from the bottom note to the top note, you count up and find how far away is that top note from the bottom note every single time you're calculating an interval. The second thing you do is you ask yourself, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? Okay, and every single example we've done so far, it does. Okay, so I'm going to show you what happens next, what happens if the top note doesn't belong to the bottom note's major scale. But if it does belong to the bottom note's major scale, then you use this side of the board. Okay, so that is what you would call a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, and an octave. They're major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and perfect octave. Okay, so now I'm going to show you what you do if the top note doesn't belong to the bottom note's major scale. So we're going to be using this side of the board. So say for example we want to measure the distance between A and C. Okay, the very first thing you do, as we've done so far with every single interval, is we find out how far away is the top note from the bottom note. So count up from the bottom note. A is 1, B would be 2, and C is 3. So we know it's some type of third. Okay, so you know it's a third. We don't know what type of third it is yet. In order to know that, we have to ask ourselves, does C belong to the bottom note's major scale? So does C belong to A major? No, it doesn't. Okay, because A major should have 3 sharps in its key signature. So A major, every single F should be sharpened, every single C should be sharpened, and every single G should be sharpened. So that C is in its normal state exists as a sharp in the scale of A major, but here we've got A natural. Okay, if it hadn't been a C sharp, it would have been a major third. Okay, because then you're saying that the top note belongs to the bottom note's major scale. So it would have been a major third, but we've made it a C natural. So we've squashed that distance. We've made that distance less. We've taken away from that interval. So we've made that interval smaller by a semitone. And when you make a major interval smaller by a semitone, you've made it minor. Okay, so lowercase for minor, minor third. Okay, so if it had have been A to C sharp, that would be a major third, because C sharp belongs to the scale of A major. C natural does not. Okay, so you take a major interval, you've made it smaller by a semitone, so it makes it a minor third. So that was the minor interval. I'll try a few more. Let me see, just rub this out. So what happens if we're looking for the distance between B and F? So the very first thing to do is calculate the distance between that B and the F. So B is 1, C is 2, D is 3, E is 4, and that F is a fifth. So we know it's a fifth of some description. Okay. What type of fifth is it? Well, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? Okay, so does F belong to the scale of B major? No, it doesn't. B major should have an F sharp in its key signature, so F, all the Fs in the scale or in the key of B major, they normally exist as F sharps. Okay, but this is F natural. So again, we've made that interval smaller. We've made what would have been a perfect interval, a perfect fifth, we've made it smaller by a semitone. So it becomes a diminished fifth. A smaller case for D. Okay. So when you're dealing with minor intervals and diminished intervals, always use the lower case for your descriptions. Okay, so diminished fifth. I'll try a few more just to get used to it, I think. So that was a diminished fifth. Let me see. Yeah, I think I'll actually keep to the B's. Let me see, I'll try B flat to E. Okay, so again, go through the same processes as before. Calculate the distance between that B flat and that E. B is 1, C is 2, D is 3, E is 4. So you know it's a fourth of some description. And now you've got to ask yourself, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? Does E belong to the scale of B flat major? No, it doesn't. B flat major usually has a B flat and an E flat. So you've taken what would have been a perfect fourth. The top note would have been flattened if it had been a perfect fourth, but you've made it a natural. Okay, so it's B flat to E natural. So you've made that distance a semitone larger, B flat to E. And that means that that perfect fourth now becomes an augmented fourth. So capital A for augmented. Okay. So the only time you use lowercase is for minor and diminished. For major, perfect, and augmented, they're all capital. Okay. So that's an augmented fourth. I'll try a few more just to get as used to it as possible. Let me see. I'll try D flat. I think make it a wee bit harder. D flat to B natural. Okay, so what is the distance between that D and the B first of all? D is 1, E is 2, F is 3, G is 4, A is 5, and B is 6. So you know it's a sixth of some description. Could be a major sixth, could be an augmented sixth, could be a minor sixth, but we don't know yet until we ask ourselves this question. Does that top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? No, it doesn't. B should be flattened in the scale of D flat major. Okay, so it's no longer flattened, it's actually just B natural. So you took what would have been a major sixth and you've made it higher. Okay, you've raised it by a semitone and it now becomes an augmented sixth. Okay, so that's an augmented sixth. So as you can see, there's quite a bit to intervals. There's quite a lot you have to remember. There's quite a lot of rules you have to follow. But it's worth practicing it as often as you can, because it's going to be different every single time. You have to take every single interval on its own terms and just go through those processes of finding the numeric distance, is the number distance between the bottom note and the top note. And then ask yourself the question, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? I'll stress that, major scale. Okay, so you have to know your major scales pretty well for this. If the top note does belong to the bottom note's major scale, then you call it by these names. So if the top note's a second away, it's a major second. If it's a third away, it's a major third. If it's a fourth or fifth away, you call them a perfect fourth or fifth. If it's a sixth or seventh away, you call them a major sixth or seventh. And if it's an octave away, you call it a perfect octave. Okay? If the top note is not part of the bottom note's major scale, then there's a little bit of extra work you have to do. Okay? You have to use these rules here. Okay, so if you had a major second, but you've made it a semitone larger, okay, then it becomes an augmented second. And all major intervals, if you make them a semitone lower, become minor seconds. Whereas the perfect fourths and fifths and octaves, if you make them a semitone larger, they become augmented again, just like major intervals. But if you make them a semitone lower, they become diminished. Okay. You don't have to worry about the reasons why perfect intervals are diminished if you lower them, and major intervals are minor if you lower them. Again, it's all to do with just the importance of those intervals, perfect, fourth, fifth, and octave. Okay, so there's a couple of more things I want to show you as regards intervals. So it may get a little bit more complex from here on out. There's two more things I want to show you. What happens if you have a key signature? Okay, so far we've just been doing intervals, but we haven't had anything here. We have had no key signature to affect any of these notes. Okay, so say for example, say for example we had, let's put in 3 sharps to signify A major. Oops. Okay, so there's 3 sharps for A major. But say we're looking for, let me see, D to B. So, how do we work out this interval? Well, believe it or not, it's exactly the same as before. We look to see, do any of these sharps, does the key signature affect any of the notes that we're working with? No, it doesn't, because you have an F sharp, a C sharp, and a G sharp, but we're dealing with a D and a B here. So those 3 sharps don't affect any of those notes, so you can just ignore it. Just ignore the key signature completely. Okay? And then work it out as normal as before. But what happens if we have, let me see, I shouldn't have rubbed them out actually, just keep them back where they were. What happens if we have those 3 sharps, but we're now dealing with a C to a B? Well, yes, that key signature now affects those notes. That C sharp affects that C. So that makes that sharp, that makes that C a C sharp. Okay, so you now pretend that you're in the scale of C sharp major to work out this interval. Even though the key signature may be A major or it's relative minor, F sharp minor, doesn't matter. Okay, so you only look to see, does that key signature affect any of the notes that you're working with? If it does, you take it into consideration. Okay, in this case it affects the C, so you pretend that you're in C sharp major to work out the distance between C and B. If the key signature doesn't affect any of those notes, then you just forget about it, just leave it alone, don't just ignore it. Okay, so what would this interval be, in fact, now that we know that we're working from C sharp major? Well, count up from C to B and you get a 7th of some description, so you know that you could be dealing with major 7ths, augmented 7ths, or minor 7ths. And ask yourself, does B belong to the scale of C sharp major? No, it doesn't. It's a semitone lower. Okay, B is normally sharpened in the scale of C sharp major, but you just have a B natural. So because it's a semitone lower, you've taken what would have been a major 7th and you've made it a minor 7th. Okay. So just to go backwards to show you what happens if you don't have that C sharp in the scale. Okay, so that's just a normal C now to a B. So you've got to ask yourself, Does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? Does B belong to the scale of C major? Yes, it does. So that's now a major seventh. So you can see how very important it is to just quickly look at the key signature and see, does it affect any of the notes that you're working with? Okay. Say for example, just keeping that C and B where they are. What happens if you're in the key of F major? Okay. And you want to know within that key, you've got a C to a B natural. Okay, so, or sorry, a C to a B. Look to see, does the key signature affect any of those notes? That B flat does. That B makes that a B flat. So you're working out, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? But in other words, does that B flat belong to the bottom note's major scale? Does it belong to C major? No, it doesn't. C major doesn't have a B flat in it. So you've taken what would have been a major seventh and you've made it lower. So you've made it a minor seventh. Okay, so you can see there's a couple of, there are times when you're going to have to take into account what the key signature is telling you, and there are times when if it doesn't affect any of the two notes you're working with, you just ignore it. So the key is to always pretend that the bottom note is the first note of the major scale. Okay, so that's the main thing to remember when working out intervals. Okay, so that's one of the things I wanted to show you, what happens if you have a key signature. So sometimes you need to use it and sometimes you don't. So you just have to look and ask yourself, does that key signature affect any of the notes you're working with? There's one more thing I want to show you just before we wrap up intervals. What happens if the interval is larger than an octave? Okay, what happens if you're dealing with, let me see, a D to an E that's way up there? Okay, so if it had been a D to an E here, that would have been a major second, because E is part of the bottom note's major scale. E is part of D major. But this is more than an octave, okay? So you do have people who'll say that, well, it could be a ninth, you know, because you're dealing with intervals that are larger than an octave. The more common way to describe it would be describe it as a compound major second. So compound meaning more than an octave. Okay, so a compound takes you as far as here at D, and then the major second you just work out from this D to this E. Okay, so a compound major second is when you have intervals that are larger than an octave. Okay, you can use the 10th, 11th, 12th, and so on. There are people who prefer to use that, but I think it's a lot cleaner and a lot easier just to say that any interval that's larger than an octave, you work out that this is your compound, okay, and then from this note to, say, the E that we were looking at, that is the distance that you now measure. Okay, after you write compound, it's easier, I think, to measure a smaller distance between that D and the E. So that'd be a compound major second. Okay, so some people would say it's just a major ninth or something, but I think compound major second is a lot easier to remember. So yeah, watch out for compound intervals as well. You could have intervals that are just larger than an octave, but just take into account the octave, which is the compound part of the description, and then work out from that higher note, that octave leap, what the distance between that note and the note that you have at the top is. Okay, so that's basically intervals. So I'll just recap on the four main rules that you need to know when calculating intervals. The first one is always count from the bottom note to the top note. Okay, so you're always working from the bottom note up. Okay. The second rule is look at the key signature and ask yourself, does the key signature affect any of the two notes that you're working with? And if it does, take it into account. Okay, so if you see an F sharp in the key signature and you've got an F as your bottom note or an F as your top note, you have to take that F sharp into consideration. Okay, so always do that. If the key signature doesn't affect any of the notes, then just ignore it. Okay. The third and probably the most important part for calculating intervals is you pretend that the bottom note is the first note of a major scale. So if the bottom note is D, for example, you pretend that you're in D major. Even if the key signature has a B flat in it that signifies that you're in F major, it doesn't matter. Just for calculating intervals, you pretend that the bottom note is the first note of your major scale. Okay, that's very important. And then you ask yourself the very last part of the rule, the fourth part, does the top note belong to the bottom note's major scale? If it does, you call it by these names. Okay, major second, third, major sixth, major seventh, and a perfect fourth, fifth, and octave. If the top note doesn't belong to the bottom note's major scale, then you use these rules here. Okay, so this will probably be very appropriate for anyone doing grade 4, grade 5, because you do start, and maybe grade 3 as well, because you do start getting into more complex intervals. Okay, and that's basically it. So in the next lesson, I think we're going to look at time signatures and note grouping, so it's something completely different. So the first 5 lessons basically were built one upon the other. Okay, so you have to know your major rule, your flat rule, how to find minor key signatures, how to write major scales, harmonic minor scales, and melodic minor scales, and now the final part, how to do intervals and how to calculate intervals and analyze intervals. Okay, so all the lessons so far have been connected. So the next lesson, time signatures, will be something a wee bit different. So hopefully that has helped you recap a lot of material that you're going to need to know for your if you're doing any exams for the Associated Board, any music theory exams. So again, if you have any questions or if you have any trouble with any of this material, please get in contact with me or leave me a message or email, or you can always get in contact with me through the website. If you just go to the Contact Me page underneath the About Me section at the top of the website.